Hi, I'm Jordan Scara.
And I'm Riley Yager, and we are both type 1 diabetics. And today we're here with a professor at ASU, Jeff Yager, to ask him some questions on the nutritional label.
Yeah, so I'm a professor in chemistry, biochemistry, and physics at Arizona State University for the last 12 years. And I'm very interested in being able to help a general audience understand things from, I'm in the School of Molecular Sciences. So kind of our whole job is to understand things from a kind of a bottom-up approach, from understanding molecular level and how that influences day-to-day things. And one thing we're all familiar with is, our diet, the food we put in our body, nutrition, dietary things. So I'm excited to answer any questions you have about understanding things from more of a molecular level.
Thank you very much. So relating to nutritional facts, is there any way you could explain the difference between a sugar and a carbohydrate? Because they do label both of them on the nutrition facts on every single label that at least I've seen.
So yeah, and in fact we have one here. The FDA requires nutritional facts on any food you eat. And I think of it as being in three primary groups that biochemists are all very familiar with. So we have things, at the top here, which are our fats. So triglyceride, lipids, oils, etc. We have carbohydrates, which are all of your sugars, starches, fibers, etc. And then we have proteins, which are things that are made up of amino acids into long chains. And all of these are typically, complex in some way. So, the basic building block of carbohydrate is typically a sugar. And then it's how many of those sugars link together. So you can have simple sugars, you can have more complicated ones. When they polymerize even more and more complicated, they become starches. When they get even longer and longer, they get to the fact where they become fiber, where your body can't even really metabolize or use them as food. So really the FDA requires these kind of three breakdowns. The other ones are just kind of essential vitamins, which are typically small molecules, most commonly, that are essential for good health. And then what I think of is some of the basic thermodynamics or basic energetics of the material up front, which is kind of, how many calories and stuff are associated with this. And so this is required on any food you eat. But you guys probably know better than anyone. A lot of people ignore this unless they're, on a diet. This is something you, as diabetics, probably look at every single day, right?
Yeah, it's definitely a huge part of your life when you have to calculate carbs and know how much you need to bolus insulin-wise to counteract those carbohydrates.
Well, maybe we'll start, instead of asking a biochemist, I'll ask a diabetic. Why is it carbohydrates are so important to, like you said, you calculate carbs. Why is it you focus on, this one, group? You don't calculate fats, right? You don't calculate proteins or minerals. Why is it you do carb calculations as a diabetic?
I would say mainly just because they're the ones that have the most sugar, or it's hard to explain, but they're the ones that have the most energy, I guess you would say, stored within them. So that particular element of a food group, or just food in general, we need to account for in order for our pancreas to kind of counteract that. But since we don't, we have to do it manually.
Actually, one of the things, just to give you a counterpoint, one of the things we teach when we teach physical chemistry and for biochemists is that fat contains more energy or more calories than carbohydrates, than sugar does. So fat that's the reason our bodies use it as storage. It's a very good dense storage of energy, or of calories, or of ways that our body can use that to make chemical energy out of. But what is it specifically about carbohydrates instead of fats that why is it you specifically look at carbohydrates and not fat? I mean, both of them store energy. Both of them are metabolized in your body.
I would say, from my knowledge that I have, just about how insulin carries the sugar
Well, I think
from
maybe
carbs.
the easiest way is if somebody said, you're a type 1 diabetic, what would you say is the hallmark of what is it to be diabetic?
It's not type 2. No, I'm kidding.
To be diabetic is to have your pancreas so that it doesn't produce insulin, or the beta cells in the pancreas don't produce insulin anymore,
Yeah.
or produce very little.
So you both have an autoimmune response at some point in your life. Both of you were quite young. You were
I
how
was
old?
6.
And you were.
And I was 8.
Yeah. So sometime before it actually was diagnosed, you had an autoimmune response where your own immune system killed off a lot of cells in your pancreas, specifically the ones that produce the hormone insulin. And insulin is the primary hormone. It's a peptide that is able to take sugar from outside of a cell into the cell. And so if your body doesn't produce it, and it's really just for that one type of molecule, it just takes glucose and takes it from outside of a cell and is the first thing that binds to it and binds to a cell receptor so that then glucose can get within the cell. And it's the first part of that mechanism to be able to get glucose from out of the cell to into the cell. And since your body doesn't produce that anymore, that's the main reason why it's a carbohydrate that you care, because it's really just binding to sugar, which is a type of carbohydrate. Fats are metabolized other ways, right? And so are proteins. So your body doesn't have the same mechanism to process sugars or carbohydrates the same way.
Mm-hmm.
So I have another question based on the nutritional fats again, and you talked a little bit about simple carbs versus complex carbs, and I'm wondering what's the difference for diabetics, how would it affect your digestion or your blood sugar based on whether is it digested more easily?
I think this is one of the key, all of these, in fact, almost all of them except proteins are a little easier to understand. But carbohydrates and fats both require a lot more, they're complicated. There's layers to understanding them. And let's start with the most basic. What does it mean to be a carbohydrate? So carbo meaning carbon, and there's so many of them. We'll say and then hydrate meaning water. So, OH2 so many times. So anything with that formula, is a carbohydrate. Mm-hmm. And most things are built up of sugars, which are typically so they typically have 6 carbons and then, 6 oxygens and 12 hydrogens, right? So this follows that formula. And this would be, for example, glucose. Or fructose, or a lot of the other isomers. Well, that's what a monosaccharide is, a single sugar. But a disaccharide, like sucrose, is 2 of them, or lactose in milk is a disaccharide. And then oligomers just mean more and more of them. So the polymerization is the idea that you can take one as a building block and just keep adding more and more of them. And that's what sugars do. Carbohydrates are the general class from simple molecules like glucose and sucrose to bigger ones and bigger ones. And so each one of those goes up from simple sugars to starches, will often get labeled here, to eventually fiber. So as you go, these become more and more complicated polymers of sugars.
So you're saying the more complex carbs are more harder to break down as they get more?
Yeah, you can think of it as the more of these you string together, the harder it is to break it down, until you eventually get to the point of it being fiber. And by the time it gets so big that it's fiber, all the sugars are so bound together, and there's so many of them bound together that your body can't even break them apart anymore. So fiber is never really metabolized or digested by you. It literally passes from, the front end to the back end, right? Like, through you. It's never part of you, right?
Yeah.
So, but as you get smaller from fiber, then it gets to where your body can break it down. And so ones that are still big, but not big enough to be fiber, are like starches, and they take longer to break down, but your body eventually breaks them down into simple sugars. It just does it over a much longer time period than simple sugars. When you ingest them directly, they don't need to be broken down first in your body. They don't need to be digested first. They can just be absorbed into and used directly for some metabolic process.
So like,
does that make sense?
Yeah, so simple sugars have like more energy because you can break them down quicker and kind of...
I wouldn't say they have more energy. In fact, I would say they have per one less. They're immediate. Like, your body uses glucose in numerous processes. It takes that along with ADP, ATP, and makes glucose phosphates and uses that as a source of energy. So it's already in the form your body needs to use it immediately. Things that are that are bigger and bigger, it first has to break them apart in your body before it can then use them. So that takes more time. There's a lot of energy there, but it takes a longer period of time. This is why if you need something because you're very low blood sugar, you take simple sugars because it brings you up fast.
Yeah.
If you take more complex carbohydrates, it still brings you up. It just takes longer because your body first has to digest them, break them apart before it can then use them.
Yeah, so like an example of like a simple sugar would be like a pack of like Smarties or like a Dum Dum or something like that. But then like a long acting, or I guess complex carb in your case, would be like peanut butter, or I don't know, something more like an apple, kind of like healthier as well. But
I would say two things about that. One is that and this is part of the the part about food, like, it's complicated because what I would say is that you're right, a simple sugar is like Smarties, or in fact, just simple sugars like monosaccharides like glucose and fructose, or disaccharides, the most common being sucrose, table sugar, are all very fast acting and are added to a ton of foods and make up most candy. A lot of cereal has a ton of added sugar, etc. I mean, it's more or less eating candy for breakfast. Yeah. But eating more complicated ones are like starches. And I think of classically those being things that are grain-based, right? Like that have wheat or rice or potato in them, or some type of grain, right? And those are more complex, more longer chain sugars all bound together that is called a starch then. And if they get too big, then they eventually become, a fiber as well. But the ones you mentioned, for example, apple, it has very simple sugars in it. That's what makes it sweet to the taste. But it also has complex ones that give it that fiber. And that's why, eating an apple is much healthier than drinking apple juice. When you drink apple juice, you just get that short-acting sugar, just those simple sugars. You're not eating a lot of that more complicated solid-like material that is those long chains of polymers. And that's something that sugars do. Like, sugars, when they're short, they dissolve in water very easily, and they can be liquid-like very easily. You can melt them. You've seen it if you heat sugar, it basically caramelizes and melt. But if you take, bigger things like rices and stuff, it's always solid. It's because you've added so many of those sugars together that it's no longer easy to dissolve and stuff. They're much bigger and they're in very solid forms, and it takes your body longer to break those down. Well, when you mention something like peanut butter, nuts don't have a lot of simple sugars in them. In fact, they're mainly other things. They have a fair amount of fat in them and a fair amount of protein in them. So they just lack a lot of carbohydrates in general. They consist mostly of these other groups. And specifically fats often help make sugars last longer over time, because fats take a while to metabolize, and it can cause fats can absorb a lot of the simple sugars and make them metabolize slower.
Okay.
Okay, well, thank you for answering some of our questions. I know as a type 1 diabetic, even I didn't know some of the things on the nutritional label. And we just wanted to thank you for answering some of our questions. And for further information, please go to our website at diabetics.org.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks.